First off, my name is Carl Blair, and I'm an election protection attorney at the Texas Civil Rights Project. Our organization, TCRP, has been on the front lines of the legal fight to protect our fellow Texans' voting rights for over 30 years. And we just wanted to start off by saying how appreciative we are to see all of you here today. And I also want to have a small caveat. I have both a 3-year-old and a small yappy dog. So if there's any barking or fussing in the background, that's what it's about. So, all right, well, let's dive in. Tonight's presentation is on incarcerated and formerly incarcerated voters in Texas. And we're going to discuss some of the issues that they face in trying to exercise their right to vote. But before we jump into tonight's presentation, I'd like to take just a little bit of time to tell you about our organization. We consider ourselves Texas Lawyers for Texas Communities. TCRP was founded in 1990. We're a nonpartisan 501c3 organization, and we're made up of 3 different units. We have a unit called Beyond Borders, which deals with border and immigration issues. We have another unit called the Criminal and Justice Unit, which deals with criminal justice reforms. And then the unit that I'm personally a member of, Voting Rights Unit. We deal with voting rights litigation, policy work, and also election protection. And we've done some form of election protection at TCRP every election cycle since 2016. So this is definitely not our first rodeo. So let's go over a brief outline of today's presentation. The first point we're going to talk about is we'll start with a discussion of who is a qualified voter in Texas. Then we're going to move on to voting issues for formerly incarcerated individuals. And we're going to take a look at the Crystal Mason case specifically. Then we're going to look at some of the unique challenges facing currently incarcerated individuals. And we're going to look at the story of how the Harris County Jail polling location came to be. Then we're going to talk about some ways in which you can participate in protecting the voting rights of our fellow Texans. And finally, with whatever time we have left, we're going to have a question and answer session. So please put any questions that may come to mind while we're going through this presentation in the chat window. And at the end of our presentation, we'll get to as many of them as we can. So before we dive in, I'd like everyone to take a look at this chart and keep it in mind while we continue our discussion. So this chart is a demographic, both racial and ethnic demographics of the Texas jail, probationer, and parolee population. So while these numbers are approximations because various reporting sources use slightly different methodologies, regardless of which methodology was used, we can clearly see that Black Texans make up a very disproportionate percentage of incarcerated Texans and a disproportionately low number of Texans who are released on probation, while Hispanics make up a disproportionately low number of inmates released on parole. So as with every voting rights issue we see in our work at TCRP, there's a strong racial justice component in play here as well. And we're going to see this chart again a little bit later in the presentation, but I wanted to put this up front just to keep that concept that voting rights in Texas is so frequently also a racial justice issue as well. So I want to draw a distinction up front about the difference between jail and prison. So jails are typically county-run facilities that predominantly house inmates who have been convicted of misdemeanors and those under pretrial detention who are awaiting trial. And unless otherwise unqualified to vote, such inmates retain their right to vote in Texas. Whereas prisons are state or federal facilities that predominantly house inmates convicted of felonies. As such, those inmates are not qualified to vote in Texas. So for the purposes of our conversation tonight, we're going to be looking at those Texans who are incarcerated in county jails. And we're going to look at a little bit why that is on the next slide. So who exactly is a qualified voter in Texas? Well, according to the election code, a qualified voter is a person who is 18 years of age or older, is a United States citizen, they haven't been determined by a court to be totally mentally incapacitated or partially incapacitated without the right to vote. They're a resident of the state of Texas, and they're also a registered voter. And to be honest, most of us we're probably pretty familiar with these portions of the requirements for being a qualified voter. But the next slide is critical for our purposes here tonight. So the Texas Election Code continues. A qualified voter is also a person who has not been finally convicted of a felony, or if so convicted, has fully discharged their sentence, including any term of incarceration, parole, or supervision, or completed a period of probation ordered by any court, or they've been pardoned or otherwise released from the resulting disability to vote. Now, for purposes of this presentation, we're going to set aside a further discussion of the pardon issue because the number of pardons issued in Texas is actually very, very small. So we're going to focus on two key points. What does it mean to be finally convicted of a felony? And what is a fully discharged sentence? So what does the term finally convicted of a felony mean? It may seem obvious, but anything leading up to, but not yet resulting in a final conviction is not a final felony conviction. And now for any non-lawyers who are here, I promise that's the most lawyer-esque statement you're going to hear from me tonight. But what that means in practical terms is a prosecution, an indictment, an arraignment, or any other criminal procedures leading up to, but not yet resulting in a final conviction are not final felony convictions for purposes of voting. So that means that a conviction on appeal isn't considered a final felony conviction. And it also means that any deferred adjudication is not considered a final felony conviction. And for anyone who may not know, deferred adjudication is essentially a type of probation. A defendant will enter a plea of guilty or no contest, and the judge hearing their case will require them to fulfill certain requirements for a certain length of time. And if the defendant completes those requirements successfully, a final conviction does not appear on their record. So any conviction on appeal and deferred adjudication, not considered a final felony conviction. All right, so why is this term finally convicted of a felony so important? So I'm going to throw some numbers at you to show the importance of this point. In Texas, we have 252 county jails. And on any given day, they average approximately 55% of all Texans in those jails are there for pretrial detention, which means they're there awaiting trial, which of course also means that they haven't been finally convicted of a felony. But in some of the larger counties, that number is well over 55%. In Bexar, it averages somewhere around 60%, while in Dallas and Harris County, that number can average over 70%. So we have 254 counties in Texas. There are 252 county jails. So this is an issue that reaches all the way from the Panhandle to Brownsville, from El Paso out to Texarkana. It touches the entirety of the state. So much like our demographic chart from a few slides ago, we're going to come back to these numbers a little bit later as well. So we're going to move on to a discussion of what the term fully discharged sentence means. So let's go back to the language used in the election code. A qualified voter is a person who, if finally convicted of a felony, has fully discharged their sentence, including any term of incarceration, parole, or supervision, or completed a period of probation ordered by any court. So let's define a few terms here. A term of incarceration is the time spent as an inmate in prison or jail after a conviction. Parole is the discretionary release of an offender by a board of pardons and paroles decision that allows them to serve the remainder of their sentence in their community under supervision. There's also mandatory supervision, which is a legislatively mandated release of an inmate to parole supervision when the combination of actual calendar time they've served and good conduct time equals their original sentence. And then finally, there's probation, which allows the defendant to remain in their community under supervision in lieu of incarceration, provided they follow the guidelines set forth by the court. So once any term of incarceration, parole, mandatory supervision, probation, once all of those are completed, a commonly used term when discussing individuals who've completed all of those items is to say that they're off paper. So a person who has a final felony conviction, once they fully discharge their sentence, at that point in time, they're said to be off paper. Anybody who hasn't fulfilled or fully discharged their sentence can be considered on paper. So I want to take a second to stop right here, and I'm going to repeat this line twice, because if there's one thing you take away from tonight's presentation, please, please, please make sure it's this point. Voting rights are automatically restored in Texas when someone has fully discharged their sentence, but they need to register to vote again. So I'm going to say that again. Voting rights are automatically restored in Texas once someone has fully discharged their sentence, but they need to register to vote again. So other states handle this issue differently than Texas does. Some states require somebody who's off paper to, once they've discharged their sentence, to make a petition to the governor or maybe the Department of Criminal Justice for their state or some other governmental agency. And only once that petition has been made and only once it's been approved, only at that point are their voting rights restored. Whereas in Texas, again, none of that's required. Voting rights are automatically restored once someone's off paper, but they will need to register to vote again. So how do some of these issues play out in real life? I'm sure many of you have likely heard of the Crystal Mason case. And while we're discussing some of the particulars of that case and some of the legal maneuvering in that case, I want you to keep in mind that the takeaway I want you to take from this case is that it highlights the absolute importance that one of the biggest problems that formerly incarcerated voters in Texas can face and do face is a lack of information about how and when their voting rights have been restored. And we see in Crystal's case, and we see in Crystal Mason's case, how that really plays out in real life. And in the spirit of full disclosure, TCRP attorneys have and continue to represent Ms. Mason in her legal fight. Okay, so what are some of the facts of this case, the relevant facts? On election day in 2016, Ms. Mason was still on federal supervised release for tax fraud, but she went to her polling location to cast a ballot in the 2016 election. The poll workers that she talked to, they weren't able to find her name on the voter roll. After some digging on their part and discussions with her, they eventually had her cast the provisional ballot. Afterwards, however, even though the provisional ballot was never counted, afterwards, she was subsequently charged with casting an illegal ballot. Now, Ms. Mason stated that she didn't see the statement on the ballot saying that people who are on supervised release aren't eligible to vote. And furthermore, a probation official would later testify in trial that nobody from his office, not a single person, nobody from his office ever informed Ms. Mason that she couldn't vote while on supervised release. However, in 2018, she was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison nonetheless. In 2020, an appeals court upheld her conviction. However, this past May, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, by an 8-1 vote, ordered the lower court to reconsider its ruling, stating in part that the appeals court, quote, erred by failing to require proof that the appellant had actual knowledge that it was a crime for her to vote while on supervised release. So basically what the state was arguing was that she should have known she wasn't able to vote. And even if she didn't know she wasn't able to vote, her intent didn't matter. Intent wasn't an issue. It didn't matter. She voted while she was on supervised release. That was enough. Fortunately, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals disagreed with that and said that there has to be some type of proof that the appellant, in this case, Ms. Mason, had actual knowledge that it was a crime for her to vote while on supervised release. And another argument that came up throughout this process is whether or not being on federal supervised release should even be considered on paper for voting rights purposes in Texas. Ms. Mason's lawyers, including my colleagues at TCRP, contend that it shouldn't, but as of now, the Court of Criminal Appeals appears to believe that it is. So I want to read a quote from Ms. Mason. She released this in a statement through her attorneys after the Court of Criminal Appeals ruling. She said that, I am pleased that the court acknowledged issues with my conviction, and I'm ready to defend myself against these cruel charges. My life has been upended for what was, at worst, an innocent misunderstanding of casting a provisional ballot that was never even counted. So, like I said before, the most important takeaway that I want you to take from Ms. Mason's case is that it really highlights the absolute necessity of making sure that every formerly incarcerated Texan is given accurate information about the restoration of their voting rights. It also really draws to mind some of the political climate that we're in right now and the hostility of certain parts of the Texas government to voting rights. So if you're ever talking to somebody who was formerly incarcerated, try and keep all of that in mind, that they need accurate information about the restoration of their voting rights. Because if not, a situation like Ms. Mason is facing and has faced for several years at this point in time is possible. So I told you that you'd be seeing this slide again, because like I mentioned before, this issue impacts thousands of Texans and vastly disproportionately impacts Texans of color. And as I mentioned again, this is every bit as much a racial justice issue as it is a voting rights issue. So now we're going to shift gears. So that previous section, including Ms. Mason, the section on Ms. Mason's case, dealt with formerly incarcerated voters. So now we're going to shift gears and we're going to discuss voters who are currently incarcerated. So where does the legal basis for voting rights for currently incarcerated individuals come from? There was a 1974 Supreme Court case called O'Brien versus Skinner. And the very short version of the factual basis of this case is that several New Yorkers who were incarcerated for either misdemeanor convictions or they were in pretrial detention were not allowed to register to vote, or they were refused absentee ballots from prison officials. This is despite the fact that in New York at the time, no state law prohibited them from voting. There was this kind of black hole. They weren't prohibited from voting. There was no special bill or special law that made provisions for them to vote, but they weren't prohibited from voting. And that was the important part. That's one of the things that SCOTUS really honed in on. And they held that inmates who are otherwise legally qualified to vote cannot be detained the right to vote solely because they're incarcerated. And as you can see from the note there, like I said, this case forms the legal basis for ensuring that currently incarcerated individuals be allowed to register to vote and cast a ballot if they're otherwise qualified to vote. If it weren't for this case, our presentation would probably be ending right now. So this is a very important case in this field. So now we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about some of the specifically unique issues facing those who are currently incarcerated in Texas who are trying to register to vote and cast their ballots. So we saw this information on a previous slide, but it bears mentioning again. And again, with 252 county jails spread across the entire state of Texas, this is definitely an issue that reaches every corner of our state. So now we're going to move into some of those unique issues that currently incarcerated voters and currently incarcerated Texans who are trying to register to vote. What are some of those unique issues that they face? And what can we do to ensure that these Texans can exercise their right to vote? So specifically, I want to talk about 3 categories of issues facing incarcerated Texans who are attempting to exercise their voting rights. First, we're going to look at some of the lack of accessible information regarding their voting rights. Then we're going to look at some difficulties in assessing voter registration materials, including the assistance of volunteer deputy registrars. And then we're going to move into some of the difficulties they face when they're actually trying to cast a ballot. So first issue, a lack of accessible information regarding voting rights. So as many of you probably know, Texas, our legislature meets once every 2 years. And one of the biggest priorities of the legislative session every time around is to set a budget for not only the state as a whole, but also its various component agencies. So this last legislative session, the Secretary of State's total budget for the 2022 and 2023 biennium is approximately $125 million. But at the same time, the state legislature only set aside $3.5 million for, quote, educating the public regarding the required documents for voting and the general voting process. That was the only specifically allocated money, or that was the only money specifically allocated to voter education in the state budget, $3.5 million. Now, the best estimate that we have is Texas has around 17 million registered voters. And so $3.5 million of public education funds for voting rights issues spread amongst 17 million registered voters is about 21 cents per registered voter. And so I wanted to add this slide because it shows how little of an emphasis the state of Texas puts on voter outreach and public education. So while this lack of readily accessible information about voting rights, this lack of public education and outreach about voting rights, it's not limited to incarcerated voters. It does impact them in some unique ways that wouldn't necessarily impact Texans who are not incarcerated. So what are some of those unique ways that it impacts incarcerated voters specifically? At the local level, we found that many sheriff's offices and elections offices have been very reluctant to provide proper guidance to inmates regarding their voting rights. Some just don't view it as a priority for their office, while others are overtly hostile to the idea. Inmates also generally lack internet access that would allow them to look up proper information about their voting rights. And what this has done is that this has created a climate of fear among some inmates that if they try and register to vote while they're incarcerated, or if they are registered to vote, but they try and cast a ballot while they're incarcerated, there's a fear that casting a ballot or registering to vote is a crime that may actually lead to them facing further criminal charges. So now we're going to move on to some of the difficulties in accessing voter registration materials that are specific to incarcerated voters or incarcerated Texans who are trying to register to vote. So due to security restrictions at jails, which upfront have been greatly heightened during the COVID pandemic. As we all know, inmate interaction with outside groups, and that includes voter registration organizations and volunteer deputy registrars, is very limited. We could go back again to the lack of internet access and just notoriously difficult to send and receive mail in jails and in jails across the state of Texas. And remember, going back to that very first bullet point, Texas has also placed, on top of all these security restrictions at jails, Texas has also placed strict restrictions on who can actually accept completed voter registration forms. It's a topic for another presentation, but if anybody doesn't know, Texas has one of the strictest, if not the strictest, voter registration regimes in the country. If you are trying to register Texans to vote, there are restrictions on where you can do it. You have to be registered as a volunteer. You have to be certified as a volunteer deputy registrar on a county by county basis. And you can only you can only accept voter registration forms from voters in the counties that you're certified in. And then there's also very strict time restraints and time restrictions on how fast you have to turn in those voter registration applications. So couple that with those security restrictions, and it makes it very difficult for outside organizations, voter registration organizations, to get access to inmates so they can help them register to vote. Okay, so say a current inmate has they've either successfully registered to vote while they've been incarcerated, or they were registered to vote prior to being incarcerated. What new challenges can they face when they actually try and cast their ballot? Well, I wanted to bring attention to one unique barrier that applies to incarcerated Texans specifically. So when somebody's booked into jail, their identification documents are confiscated. Any driver's licenses, any state ID cards, all of those type of documents are confiscated. They're held by either jail authorities or prison authorities, depending on where they are, but they're held by authorities. So after that point in time, usually sometime within 3 to 7 days after they've been booked and processed into jail, they're issued an inmate identification card. Some locations call it an offender identification card, some call it an inmate identification card, but that's really a distinction without meaning. But within that first couple of days, they're issued an inmate identification card that has their name and picture. But even though inmate IDs are government issued photo IDs, they are not an acceptable form of voter ID in Texas. And to couple that off, to add to that, I should say, Reasonable impediment declarations do not include an option to list a lack of access to identification due to incarceration. And I'm going to give a quick interlude about reasonable impediment declarations for anybody who may not be familiar with that idea. So as we all know, Texas has a very strict voter ID law on the books. There are only a handful of types of IDs that are acceptable for a voter to bring for a voter to present to vote in Texas. Driver's license, state ID, military ID, passports, concealed handgun license. There are about 7 total. None of them are an inmate ID, first off. So if somebody tries to vote and they don't have one of those acceptable forms of photo ID, they can fill out a reasonable impediment declaration, which provides them an option to show some secondary identification, as long as there's a stated reason for them not having the photo ID. Those are some reasons are a lack of transportation, a physical inability to travel to the location where you would need to get that ID, a lost or stolen ID. But for our discussion, what's most important is that none of those reasons, there's no option on there that lists a lack of access to identification due to incarceration. So there's also, compounding all of this, there's also no statewide requirement that jail authorities have to provide inmates with access to their identification for voting purposes. So even if an incarcerated Texan has the proper ID, they have a driver's license. Once they're booked and processed, that driver's license is taken away from them, held by authorities. They don't necessarily have the right to have access to that identification for voting purposes, even though they have the correct form of ID, a correct photo ID. They're not required. The jail authorities are not required to provide that to them. So one thing I wanted you to kind of take away from the discussion about inmate IDs is that a lot of the voting rights laws or so-called election integrity laws that have been passed in Texas work in tandem with each other to suppress and make it harder for Texans to vote. So in certain cases, a reasonable impediment declaration it makes it easier for some Texans to vote if they don't have some of those IDs, or if they don't have one of the acceptable photo IDs. But in the case of inmates, it's actually just one extra hurdle that they may not be able to overcome. So I'd like you to keep in mind that a lot of these different rules and laws that we talk about, they kind of work together as kind of a web of voter suppression. Okay, so say that the inmate, they've registered to vote, or they were registered to vote beforehand. They've got their ID, they've got all this information, they're ready to cast their ballot. So people in Texas can generally cast a ballot in one of 2 ways, either they can mail in their ballot or they can vote in person. So let's talk about the mail-in ballot issue with currently incarcerated Texans. So as we're probably aware, there are only a few groups of Texans who are eligible to cast a mail-in ballot in Texas. Older voters, people who will be out of the county during the entirety of early voting and on election day. And then also some groups, people who have physical challenges of actually going into a polling location. And one of the groups is people who are incarcerated. So being incarcerated is a qualifying reason to request a mail-in ballot in Texas. They can do that by requesting a mail-in ballot by filling out the Secretary of State's online form, or by requesting a mail-in ballot directly from their county elections office. But as we mentioned before, we run into those exact same problems we discussed when talking about why incarcerated Texans have difficulties accessing voter registration materials. Unreliable mail service, lack of internet access, jail authorities who may not cooperate with or may not assist in any way inmates who are trying to exercise the right to cast a ballot. And on top of that, there's also a quirk in Texas election law that deals specifically with people who are incarcerated that I kind of deemed the 11-day problem. So an application for a mail-in ballot has to be received by the county no later than 11 days before election day. So what happens if somebody's booked and processed into jail on 10 days before election day or within that 11-day window? There's no way for them to cast a mail-in ballot. That's what happens. There's no way in that 11-day window between the last day when mail-in ballots have to be received by the county and election day. There's no way that somebody who's processed into jail in that 11-day period can cast a mail-in ballot. So you can see there that that's kind of a unique problem. And there are definitely, I don't have specific numbers, but there are of course people who are booked and processed into jails leading up to those every day of that 11-day period, every election cycle. And you also have the kind of bizarre situation where a person could be ineligible to receive a mail-in ballot until they're booked and processed into jail, when they automatically become eligible to cast a mail-in ballot if they're otherwise qualified to vote. So yeah, it works together in a weird way. And there's, like I said, there's this 11-day problem where there's an 11-day period of time where there's certain people who, even though they're eligible to cast a mail-in ballot, literally have no way to actually do so. So that was mail-in ballots. So what about somebody who's trying to vote in person? Well, access to in-person voting for incarcerated Texans is literally non-existent, with the sole exception of the Harris County Jail's polling location that was first used for the November 2021 general election. And at the time of this presentation, Cook County, so Chicago, Los Angeles, and DC are currently the only other locales in the entire nation with a polling location in their county jail, or in the District of Columbia, their equivalent of a county jail. So Harris County Jail's polling location was very historic. It was the first of its kind, not just in the state of Texas, but one of the very first in the entire nation. So let's go into some detail about the Harris County Jail. It is the third largest jail in the nation, and on any given day, it houses approximately 9,000 inmates. And as we mentioned before, on any given day, over 70% of those inmates are there under pretrial detention. And as it shouldn't surprise anybody, it's operated by the Harris County Sheriff's Office. Now here, we're going to go into some background about how the Harris County Jail polling location came into being. So for years, a number of organizations in Texas have been working towards getting incarcerated Texans registered to vote. And in 2018, a group called Houston Justice started their Project Orange initiative for the purposes of registering incarcerated Texans in the Harris County Jail specifically. And they called themselves they called it the Project Orange Initiative because of the orange jumpsuits that the inmates wear at the Harris County Jail. So soon afterwards, Project Orange, TCRP, and other allied organizations began discussions with a wide range of Harris County officials about the possibility of establishing, again, a first of its kind in Texas, polling location in the Harris County Jail, so qualified voters incarcerated there could actually cast their votes in person. There were a number of logistics challenges that had to be addressed, as well as strong pushbacks from opponents of the proposal. And that dragged out the length of these discussions between activists and Harris County officials for several years. Some of the logistics issues that opponents cited were making sure that the polling location was accessible to the voting public, implementing special security measures for election workers and inmates, a lack of accessible identification for inmates, like we talked about, and also limited internet connectivity in the jail. However, due to the prolonged activism of these organizations and the willingness of Harris County officials to work with them, in 2019, the Harris County Commissioners Court, by a 3-2 vote, authorized the proposal to place a polling location in the Harris County Jail. However, still further discussions had to be held regarding overcoming those logistics issues, and then COVID-related delays hit. So even though the proposal was authorized in 2019, it wasn't until Election Day, November 2nd, 2021, when the first in-jail polling location in the state opened its doors to incarcerated Texas voters. So while I wasn't personally at TCRP while this initiative was taking place, I can say from speaking with some of my colleagues who were involved that they're all very proud of the work that they contributed to its success. And our organization is proud to continue to partner with groups like Project Orange, other organizations like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Texas Organizing Project, Move Texas, the ACLU of Texas, and just a lot of other organizations and activists. And that's to continue the fight to ensure that all eligible incarcerated Texans are actually able to exercise their right to vote. So I want to leave with a quote from Darrell Douglas, who is actually the founder and executive director of Project Orange. He said it was a very rewarding experience to expand democracy to people who should have had that right all along. And that's one of those issues that's one of those statements that kind of points to things that we've been talking about this entire presentation. There's so many extra hurdles that incarcerated Texans and formerly incarcerated Texans face in trying to exercise their right to vote, even if that right should never have been abridged, even if they were still qualified to vote the whole time. All of these extra burdens and hurdles make it harder for them to cast a ballot. So that I think is what, I don't want to speak for Mr. Douglas, but I think that's what he was really talking about. And I think that his quote really hits on that point. Many of these people who've had these extra hurdles thrown at them, who've had to overcome these extra obstacles to cast their ballot or to register to vote, they should have had that right to do so all along without extra steps and hurdles to be taken. So the next step in this fight that's taking place as we speak is to get more counties across the state to agree to open polling locations in their county jails. So what are some of the other next steps that can be taken? As I just mentioned, push for more counties to open up polling locations in their county jails. As the Harris County polling location shows, that takes a lot of dedication on the part of activists and organizations, and a willingness by county officials to actually engage in that conversation in a good faith way. We can also fight for better access to voter registration materials and access to VDRs for incarcerated Texans. We can support organizations fighting to ensure that both incarcerated and formerly incarcerated Texans are given accurate and timely information about their voting rights and the restoration of their voting rights. And we can advocate for legislation and policies at the federal, state, and local levels that ensure that the voting rights of the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated are protected. So that's the end of the discussion on incarcerated and formerly incarcerated voters. Now I'd like to kind of move into a different gear, and that's kind of a discussion of what everyone on this call can do to actually help protect the rights of our fellow Texans, the voting rights of our fellow Texans. And I promise I will stop talking and turn the floor over to everybody for questions you may have as soon as we get through these last couple of slides. So here's an important question that I want to ask. What can you do to help protect the voting rights of our fellow Texans? Well, we are, as I mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation, TCRP, we're a group of Texas lawyers for Texas communities. And so one of the main cogs, one of the biggest things we try and do every election cycle through our election protection efforts is we try and recruit people in the legal field. I'm a lawyer, many of my colleagues are, and we want to recruit our fellow legal professionals to join us in this fight to protect the voting rights of our fellow Texans. So we have a link here, texascivilrights.org/22EP-legal. And that is a link that you can go to. And if you're interested, you can sign up to be an election protection legal volunteer at that site. And then, speaking as a lawyer myself, just from a personal level, from a personal standpoint, I have a 3-year-old son, like I said, this fight to help protect the rights of my fellow Texans and our fellow Texans is personal to me. I want him to grow up in a Texas where, you know, every Texan is treated better, where every Texan is treated equally, where our votes matter. You know, I want him to grow up in a Texas for all Texans. And the way that I choose to do that, the way that I use my experience, my knowledge, is by election protection work. So I'm protecting the rule of law, and I'm trying to make the world a little bit better for my son. So if you have a similar motivation, you know, you want to protect our democracy, you want to protect voting rights, you want to protect and promote the rule of law, please take a look at this. Please click on that link, take a look at that sign up site, and think about being an election protection legal volunteer with us. So what would you actually be doing as a legal volunteer? Functionally, you'd be providing customer service for Texas voters. You could help them navigate our state's harsh and undemocratic voting laws. You can help them solve complex issues that help these voters, our fellow Texans, exercise their voting rights. We will be operating command centers all across Texas during early voting and on election day to address systemic issues that arise, and we will file litigation on the spot if necessary. But we can't do it alone. We can't do it without the help of good folks like you, your friends, your colleagues, your coworkers. We can't do it without our fellow legal professionals in the field. And so what we're asking is some of your time and some of your expertise. And I can tell you, if you work on an election day, whether it's an early voting day or on election day itself, it's going to be a long day, but at the end of the day, you'll feel exhausted, but also I've always felt invigorated after every day when I've done that. I've always felt that it was something that was worthwhile, even though the day is very long. It can be stressful. We're lawyers. We're all used to long, stressful days for good and bad. But I'd rather have a long and stressful day where I knew that I helped some of my fellow Texans cast a ballot. You know, that I was able to help them exercise their right to vote. So that's my sales pitch. We'd love to have every one of you on board. The fact that you're here today shows that you're interested in these issues and topics, and also that you wanted CLE, which, you know, I understand, but we'd love to have you jump on board. So I'm gonna one more slide and then we'll get to, here's what you were all waiting for. I know, here is the CLE credit number. You can also scan that QR code. If you want, it'll take you to the state bar's website, I believe, where you can just claim the credit number automatically that way. I'll leave that up for a minute. And then also there at the bottom, again, is our sign up link for election protection. So, all right, I'll give everybody a minute to either write that number down or scan that QR code, and then we will move on to the Q&A session. All right, so yeah, let's move on to questions now. All right, we've got about 10 minutes or so we get to whatever questions y'all may have.
Carl, I think there's a couple in the Q&A bubble down there, if you want to check it out.
Yes, yeah, I just saw that. Thanks, Emily. That lovely voice was my colleague, Emily Eby. She and I work together on the election protection team, so. Leola Ross, a group in Fort Bend County has worked with the sheriff to enable voter registration in the county jail. They've conducted at least one registration session with plans to do more. And there's also been discussion about setting up a polling location in the county jail. That's fantastic. That's exactly the type of activism that's going to hopefully help alleviate some of those difficulties that incarcerated Texans face when trying to cast their ballot. Yeah, it is a time-consuming process. And like I mentioned before, it also requires a willingness on the part of county officials to actually engage in these discussions. So Yeah, that's really great for Fort Bend. Leola, do you, if you would, do you happen to know the name of that group, or are you a member of that organization? I'll move on to the next question, but if Leola, if you do have that information, just please feel free to put that in the chat, or if you feel comfortable sharing it, please feel free to put that in the chat. Beth Gillespie, can law students and non-lawyers help too? Yes, yeah, absolutely. We have some other organizations that we partner with in an election protection coalition. And some of them, Emily and I specifically, through the CLE presentation, we specifically deal with the legal volunteer side. But yeah, absolutely, we can provide sign up information for non-lawyers. As for law students, absolutely. Oh, thanks, Amy. Amy said that the QR code allowing the CLE reporting was awesome. So we're glad to have you back, Amy. But yeah, going back to Beth's question, yeah, law students absolutely can too. Emily, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but anybody wants to assist on election day or during early voting, working on one of the hotlines where voters call, they don't have to be lawyers, right? They don't have to be licensed attorneys, correct?
Sorry for the suspense. I couldn't get to my unmute. Absolutely. We are happy to have anybody who works on, with a working knowledge of voting rights, anybody with like vague knowledge of the law, happy to have them. If they have no knowledge of the law, we can absolutely use them with our partner Common Cause as a poll monitor to stand outside the polling place and solve basic issues for voters. We've got all kinds of ways to use everybody.
Right. Gail Dickinson, how did Harris County solve the problems in creating voting at the jail? It depends on which of the issues. Some of the issues were they created, like take the issue of making the polling location accessible to the public. They actually created 2 separate rooms with poll workers and election equipment. Excuse me. Yeah, they actually created 2 specific rooms. So they had one which was for the general public, and then the other room was specifically for inmates. And if I remember correctly, a sheriff's deputy would take, I want to say 3 or 4 inmates at a time. And they would each go, they would vote in that small group would go in and vote. And then the rest of them, sorry about that. I had a Slack notification pop up. Sorry about that. But yeah, sheriff's deputy would take a small group of inmates into the room specifically for inmates voting. They would vote, they would take them out back to their cells, and then they would bring the next group in. I think on the general election, I want to say it was about 15 or so inmates voted. So while the number itself wasn't a huge number, it was a successful pilot attempt. And it was actually used again earlier this year for primary elections, and there are obviously plans to keep it going. As for some of the other issues, the added security, that I don't know. I don't know if that was, I don't believe that information was necessarily released to the public. The other specific security policies or regulations for the inmates and election workers. And then some of the technical issues were just, just tech fixes, like hotspots for internet access, things like that. So it was some creative problem solving on the part of Harris County and the activists and organizers who were working on the issue. And again, it just goes to show that when you have the drive of activists and organizations, and it meets elected officials and county officials who are willing to work with them, that's when real change is possible on an issue like this. Dorothy Marchand, oh, I'm so sorry the chat was disabled. I didn't realize that. I apologize about that. Leola is from the League of Women Voters. Thank you very much, Dorothy. Bridges to Empowerment, Leola posted something right there. Bridges to Empowerment, they reached out to me as I'm voter services chair for the League of Women Voters of Fort Bend. Oh, and it says they're building on the successor Project Orange in Harris County too. Well, Leola, please, if your chapter of the league or Bridges to Empowerment would like to speak with us about anything we can do to help them, just please let us know. Please reach out to us. All right, next. Oh, recognizes, yeah, Leola said that Bridges to Empowerment is recognized as a Project Orange partner. Yeah, that's the Project Orange is a fantastic organization. And like I said, we're proud that we were able to help them in our small way about that. Dorothy, will the slideshow and recording be available for participants to share? We have some leagues that are interested in getting involved in voter registration for incarcerated voters, and this would be most helpful. As far as I know, Emily, are we going to, we are recording this presentation. I believe we're still working on a way to share the recorded presentation though.
Yeah, but Dorothy, I'd be happy to circulate it to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I just mentioned to Leola, Dorothy, any of those leagues who are interested in that, please have them reach out to our organization and we can see if we can offer any assistance on that. Allison, QR code didn't work for me. Can I have the number again? I've done election protection for the last 2 cycles. It's super fun out at the polling place or in the boiler room. Yeah, Allison, I can guarantee that you absolutely did make a huge difference. So yeah, and yeah, absolutely. Let me.
I dropped the CLE number in the chat.
Oh, thank you, Emily.
Hopefully everyone can see it.
Yes. Fern also asked for the CLE credit number. Yeah, let me minimize my chat window for just a second and I'll go back a slide and that should pop back up for everybody. There we go. It's 174164117. I'll repeat that. It's 174164117. Does anybody else have any other questions or any comments, thoughts they'd like to bring up? All right. Well, it was an absolute pleasure speaking with y'all tonight. Thank you so much for your time, and so glad to have you here. And thank you so much for joining us. And please make sure that you come back next Wednesday when Emily and I will have we'll be watching our colleague Janelle Killingsworth, who is going to be giving a presentation on SB1 and how it's changed voting in Texas. So next Wednesday, the 27th at 6 p.m. Central. Thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.